church this morning. The fact of the matter is, conflict in churches can get ugly. And conflicts can happen in many different ways. Let me give you a couple of examples. A church sets out to find a new pastor, but they fail to do their homework. One group in the church desires a pastor who will be more of a chaplain, somebody who will visit regularly in their homes, drink coffee around the kitchen table, chew the fat in the parlor. The other group desires a pastor who will lead them forward to reach new people, to win converts to Jesus Christ. One group is looking for a pastor who will love them by being regularly in their homes. The other is looking for a pastor who will love them through solid biblical preaching, teaching, and evangelism. Neither group is necessarily right or wrong, but the reality is very few pastors are good at both. So inevitably, a church hires one kind or the other. What that means is one group is really happy, the other group is not. One group is excited, the other group tends to be critical, and conflicts arise. There's an old joke in preacherly circles. Pastors heard to say, I made everybody happy in my last church. I made 50% of them happy when I came, and I made the other 50% happy when I left. Conflict in the church. Let me give you another example. Some years back, I watched as a church in Mount Juliet set out to reach young people by trying to blend their worship service. They hired a very gifted musician, a friend of mine actually, to lead them to knit together the exciting, upbeat, new contemporary songs with the more traditional songs found in the hymnal. He was uniquely suited to do this. Gifted guitar player, band leader, the whole shooting match. There was just one problem. The leadership and their pastor ignored a rather large group in that church that hated any music that was not found in the 1992 Baptist hymnal. I warned my friend about that because I knew that a big chunk of that church had split off another church that had split over doing that very thing. I warned him. So, no, the pastor and the leaders are all in this. What happened? Well, one group said, all we ever sing are those goofy little 7-11 songs, 7 words 11 times. The other group said, all we ever sing are those old, antiquated songs that nobody understands anyway. My friend lasted as a minister of music there about a year, and the pastor lasted just a few months longer. Conflict in the church. Unmet expectations, hurt feelings, and a determination to have it my way or the highway lead to conflict, lead to accusation. Over the years, I've heard and I've read about many accusations that grow out of conflict. I don't know who my deacon is. The pastor never preaches, fill in the blank, evangelistic sermons, spiritual sermons, funny sermons. The youth minister never returns my phone calls. I was in the hospital and nobody came to see me. And this is the joke among preachers too. She never told anybody she was in the hospital, but she was upset that nobody came to see her. My Sunday school teacher does not believe the Bible, and this one actually made headlines in the Baptist Reflector, our state newspaper. Clapping in worship is irreverent. And here's the thing. If gossip has taken root in a church, it is highly unlikely that any conflict will ever be resolved in a healthy fashion. It works like this. Somebody approaches his deacon and says, hey, you, the pastor, and the other deacons need to know there are a whole bunch of people that are upset over the fact that the organist keeps playing Bach and Beethoven and not Bill Gaither. To which the deacon replies, oh my goodness, well, who's upset? Because the pastor Minister of Music and I need to go talk to that person or those people to assure them we are actually working on getting a good balance between classical music and more traditional church music, to which the person replies, "Oh, I can't tell you who's upset. I was told that in confidence." That's gossip, my friends. Griping, complaining, or criticizing without trying to resolve a problem is the very biblical definition of gossip. It's called stirring up strife among the brethren. And let me tell you what, if you or I listen to that kind of critical spirit without trying to do something about it, you and I are just as guilty of gossip as that individual who's running around trying to stir things up. And when gossip gets a toehold in the church, it's like kudzu. It spreads like kudzu. It chokes the church. It kills the joy, and it ruins that church's reputation. The church at Corinth was riddled with conflict. We have some guests here this morning. I'll tell you a quick story while you're turning. Years ago, I preached a sermon that I preached at least once a year. Sometimes I'll skip a year on how to keep gossip from hurting my church. I preached this message. We had a guest that morning. She came, she didn't come back. And so one of the deacons and I we were out visiting people back when we still knocked on doors and visited people. And we said, we really enjoyed having you for the last couple of Sundays, but we hadn't seen you in a while. She said, "Oh, I left a church where there was gossip. I don't want to be in a church that has gossip." And Brian and I looked at each other and I said, "Ma'am, we don't have a problem with gossip. I was preaching that sermon as a preventative measure." Okay, so I want to give you that disclaimer. We have some guests here this morning. This is not a left-handed sermon where there's a problem and I'm just kind of obliquely dealing with it. I'm preaching through 2 Corinthians, and what you're going to find out if you ever read 2 Corinthians was that was one messed up church. Corinth was riddled with conflict. They fought over everything. They fought over who was the best leader. Paul, who started the church. Apollos, who grew the church. Peter, who was one of Jesus' best friends. Or Jesus. They fought over who was the best. They sued each other in the community law courts before unbelievers. They argued about marriage. They argued about eating meat sacrificed to idols. They argued about spiritual gifts. They argued about the Lord's Supper. Paul wrote multiple letters to this church trying to help them sort through their conflicts. He was actually on his way for another visit to Corinth. He told them he was coming, when he found out that someone in the church had attacked him personally. Now, we don't really know what the attack was, but it was serious enough that it created a major rift in the church. Not that that was all that difficult. This church seemed to be a place looking for a reason to be upset. And there are churches like that, let me tell you. Anyway, Paul skipped his promise to visit and wrote a letter to help them kind of sort through the problem. We pick up the story in verse 1 of 2 Corinthians chapter 2. And once again, I'm reading from the New Living Translation. Apparently, Paul was pretty upset, passionate. I don't know. His Greek is almost classical Greek in its structure, which usually leads to very awkward English. The New Living does a really good job of smoothing over all of this awkwardness. Look at verses 1 to 3. Paul wrote, "So I decided that I would not bring you grief with another painful visit." He's constantly dealing with conflict in the church. "For if I cause you grief, who will make me glad? Certainly not someone I have grieved. That is why I wrote to you as I did, so that when I do come, I won't be grieved by the very ones who ought to give me the greatest joy. Surely you all know that my joy comes from your being joyful." Well, in the following verses, I want to take a look at some principles for dealing with conflict in the church. This morning in Sunday school, we talked about relationship skills. One of the things I've learned as a pastor doing premarital counseling, most folks don't know how to deal with conflict in the home because their parents either did it badly or did it behind closed doors, and they never saw a positive model for conflict resolution. Well, guess what? Churches are just like a family, and many, many churches don't know how to deal with conflict. So I want to look at some principles for conflict that I believe stand behind how Paul and his friends at Corinth dealt with the conflict at Corinth. First principle, meet the problem head on. Meet the problem head on. Look at verse 4. I wrote that letter in great anguish with a troubled heart and many tears. I didn't want to grieve you, but I wanted to let you know how much love I have for you. As I have been in churches where there were conflicts, quite often the unwillingness to confront was out of a mistaken idea about what love is. Oh, I don't want to hurt their feelings. I love them too much to hurt their feelings. No, if you love someone, you'll confront that person if need be. Now, Paul couldn't be there in person, partly because he didn't want yet another painful visit. But you'll find out in verse 12 that a doorway for ministry, there was an opportunity for people to be saved, and Paul had an opportunity to be involved in that. So he stayed in Macedonia and instead wrote this letter that we don't have, showing his friends how to deal with the conflict, and the leaders of the church dealt with the problem head on, as we will see. Now, too often what I have observed and read about in my studies about churches is that when there's a conflict in the church, quite often the default setting is the leaders stick their heads in the sand and hope that it'll blow over. The trouble is, conflict that is ignored seldom blows over, regularly blows up. I'm getting ready for the sermon. I read an article about conflict resolution theory in organizations, and one of the things that was said was the longer a problem is allowed to fester, the less likely there will be a positive outcome. So you got to meet the problem head on, and you need to do it sooner than later. And no big surprise, Jesus outlined how we're supposed to do that in Matthew 18. Now, it may surprise you to learn that Jesus only used the word church 3 times in his earthly ministry. Twice in this upcoming passage. In Matthew 18, Jesus said, if your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, then you have won your brother. If he refuses to listen to you, take 1 or 2 more with you, that at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every fact may be confirmed. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, then let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax gatherer. In other words, let him be somebody you assiduously avoid. Jesus said, meet the problem head on. A couple of practical suggestions to make that possible. A, get both parties together. That may sound like a duh statement, but surprisingly, people don't think of doing this. It always takes 2 to tango, and that's especially true in conflict. In Matthew chapter 18, Jesus dealt with the person who was offended. In Matthew chapter 5, he gave instructions to the offender. He has just talked about anger in Matthew chapter 5, and then he goes on to say, therefore, if you're presenting your offering before the altar, you've come to church. And you there remember that your brother has something against you. You've done something, and he's mad at you. Leave your offering before the altar. Go your way. First, be reconciled to your brother. Get things right with your brother. Then come to church. Then come and present your offering. That's often the case in church conflict, that it grew out of a miscommunication or misunderstanding. So you get the 2 parties together, and clarification results in a resolution. In other cases, somebody may have to say, you know what, I was wrong, I'm sorry, I did not mean to hurt your feelings. Would you please forgive me? But none of that will happen until you get both parties together. B, if we're going to meet the problem head on, B, don't give in to gossip. This is huge. If we keep a conflict shared with us in confidence, and it tears the church apart, what have we done? What have we done? Oh, friends, please, don't be so quick to give a promise of confidentiality when somebody comes to you with a criticism, with a hurt feeling, or what have you. If you listen to that kind of critical spirit, you listen to those criticisms, you listen to that hurt feeling, that person's upset with somebody. Oh, don't tell anyone I told you this. You do nothing. You're as guilty of gossip as that person. Tell it to a leader. And don't say, oh, I can't tell you who's upset because it was told me in confidence. In Proverbs 26, verse 20, Solomon wrote, fire goes out without wood, and quarrels disappear when gossip stops. I've told you this before. When the pulpit committee came to me, told me about the church, the history of conflict that the church has had, I wanted to sit down and talk to the deacons. And I asked them, will you go with me to confront conflict head on? Will you go with me to confront gossip if it ever rears its ugly head? I need to know now, because if you will not give me your heartfelt promise that you will do that, I won't even pray about coming here. I had just left a church where the deacons would not face conflict, would not confront gossip, and I made myself a promise, never again. Never again. I'll just tell you, the deacons' eyes were this big, but they all gave me their solemn word. Meet the problem head on. Secondly, recognize the danger to the church. Recognize the danger to the church. No one likes to confront conflict, not even the Apostle Paul. Look at verse 5. I'm not overstating it when I say that the man who caused all the trouble hurt all of you more than he hurt me. Now, Paul's already said, man, I wrote that letter in tears and anguish. I didn't want to write it, but I had to write it. I had to confront this. And here we find why. It hurt the church. The conflict hurt the church. He had to deal with it. And the leadership at Corinth recognized they had to deal with it for the same reason. Unresolved conflict will poison a church. Hebrews 12, 14 and 15 clearly explain it. Work at living in peace with everyone. We are called to be peacemakers, not peacekeepers. Not rolling over and play dead to keep the peace. Peacemakers, which can involve confrontation. And so work at living in peace with everyone and work at living a holy life. For those who are not holy will not see the Lord. Look after each other so that none of you fails to receive the grace of God. Watch out that no poisonous root of bitterness grows up to trouble you, corrupting many. When conflict goes unresolved in the church, when people wait too long to confront it, the hurt feelings grow to animosity, grow to bitterness, and they will poison the church. Have you ever been in a poisoned church? I have. You can feel it when you walk in. People keeping everybody at arm's length. You cut the tension with a knife. My first pastorate, I followed a pastor. Bottom line, the church had a split the year before I came. 100 regular attenders, leaders, fled that church like rats fleeing a sinking ship. And that church was angry. They blamed each other for the split that happened. Now you all know, I guess you don't know, and you're probably not going to believe it when you hear it in the sermon, but I like to use humor in my sermons. Well, for the first 3 months, I used my best stuff. I couldn't even get a holy grunt out of those people, let alone a laugh. They were so mad at each other. And when I would be out in the community, as we all are, and strike up a conversation with a community leader or somebody that had been in the community for a while, found out that he or she had go to church, I'd invite them to come to Bethel Baptist Church. And invariably they would say, Bethel Baptist? Isn't that the church that's mad at each other? Recognize the danger to the church. Meet the conflict head on, recognize the danger. Thirdly, censure a stubbornly divisive person. Censure a stubbornly divisive person. Look at verse 6. Most of you opposed him, and that was punishment enough. Now, the New Living does a good job of translating and smoothing over the awkward language. They went too far here. Most of you opposed him. That sounds like most of you disagreed with him. Most of you said, oh, come on, Paul's not like that. That's not what that means. The word opposed there means censure. And censure means to impose a penalty or to reprimand someone. Apparently, the man wouldn't let it go. The leadership confronted him, tried to straighten it out. He wouldn't stop bad-mouthing Paul. So they told it to the church, and the church censured him. The majority censured him. Remember what Jesus said? If he refuses to listen to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile or a tax gatherer, somebody you avoid. Bible scholars I read pretty much agreed that at the very least, they refused to allow him to take the Lord's Supper. At the very worst, they may have told him not to come back to church so he could straighten out his attitude. Now today, you tell somebody that, they'll just go to the church down the street. Not in Paul's day. This was the only gathering of believers in Corinth. Let me give you an example of how it can work. At a big First Baptist church in East Tennessee, the chairman of the deacons wanted his college dropout son to be the youth minister of the church. Now that young man had a ton of charisma, very little education, very little self-discipline, and absolutely no experience. And to make matters worse, church already had a youth minister. So at a deacons meeting, the chairman of the deacons accused the youth minister of destroying the youth group, of running off all the youth. Well, the youth minister had been warned what the meeting was about, so he brought the Sunday school records prepared, not by himself or his wife, but by the Sunday school secretary, which clearly showed that the youth group had grown immensely under his tenure. He had not run the teenagers off. There were more teenagers than they had had 2 years before. Well, when all that was put forth, that deacon got red-faced and he said, I'll split this church if I have to get you fired. Well, when the rest of the deacons got over their initial shock at what that man had said, they let him know in no uncertain terms he was on his own and out of line. Thankfully, that was the end of it. But friends, if it had not been the end of it, and I've been in this business long enough, and I've heard stories and seen my fair share as well over the years, if that had not been the end of it, and sometimes it's not, the deacons needed to tell the church what had happened. And the church would have needed to tell that man to shut up and sit down, even if he was chairman of the deacons and a powerful leader in the community. Now, I've included in your notes the other places in the New Testament where that very thing is commanded. Meet the problem head on. Recognize dangers in the church. Get this straight. Censure a stubbornly divisive person. Those words were chosen very carefully. Fourthly, forgiveness must be freely given. Freely given. Look at verses 7 to 11. Now, however, it is time to forgive and comfort. Otherwise, he may be overcome by discouragement. So I urge you now to reaffirm your love for him. I wrote to you as I did to test you and see if you would fully comply with my instructions. When you forgive this man, I forgive you too. And when I forgive whatever needs to be forgiven, I do so with Christ's authority for your benefit, so that Satan will not outsmart us. For we are familiar with his evil schemes. Oh, are we really? 50% of all churches had a conflict in the church in the last 3 years over which they lost members. Are we really ignorant of his schemes? In that first church I served as pastor, those folks were so angry, so mad at each other, so unforgiving towards each other, that until they began to forgive each other, the atmosphere in that church was like a broom closet stuffed full of open gas cans and oil-soaked rags. The least little spark and poof! Let me tell you what, for 2 years there was a lot of poofing going on. And one of the deacons and I spent an awful lot of time going around putting out fires. Bottom line, when people get together and care about their church, there are going to be miscommunications, misunderstandings, hurt feelings. We need to get together, sort it out, ask forgiveness, give forgiveness. Because Satan is looking for a toehold. He wants to poison the church. He wants to ruin our reputation. That's why Paul said in Colossians chapter 3, therefore, as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another, and forgiving each other. Whoever has a complaint against anyone, as the Lord Christ forgave you, so also should you. Dealing with conflict in the church. The visitors to a zoo one day were surprised by an exhibit entitled Coexistence. Have you seen the bumper stickers that say coexist? And they have all of the cultural and religious symbols worked into the word, and the subliminal message, of course, is, can't we all just get along? Well, in this exhibit entitled Coexistence, there was a lion, king of the beast, and 4 or 5 lambs. I don't know if the zookeeper was a Christian and he remembered the passage where it says, where the lion will lie down with the lamb. Well, invariably, the zookeeper was asked by a visitor to the zoo, how in the world are you able to help those 2 species coexist? And the zookeeper's answer was always the same, oh, it's not that hard. From time to time, I just have to add a few new lambs. I love how people get it a little bit at a time. Did you notice that? Galatians 5:15 says, but if you bite and devour one another, take care that you're not consumed by one another. Let's resolve conflict in the church before conflict dissolves the church. Lord, I thank you for a team of deacons who love you and who are committed to guarding the unity of our church. I thank you for, gosh, in September, 17 years the most peaceful, unified church experience years of my career. God, help us, however, to be ever vigilant, because we're frail, fallen creatures of dust, and we mess up and inadvertently hurt feelings, and there will be misunderstandings, and we've got to be on our guard. Not to gossip, but to deal with conflict, to resolve the conflict, to be peacemakers. Your word shows us how. Help us to overcome our fallenness and guard the unity of our church. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Jesus, in his Beatitudes, made a very insightful statement. Does that surprise you? Jesus made an insightful statement. He said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." He did not say, "Blessed are the peacekeepers," people who will bend over backwards, roll over, play dead, do whatever it takes not to stir up, and confront somebody who's upset. He said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Jesus waded into our world that was broken and had run away from God to make peace between God and people. And it cost him his life, didn't it? So he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons and daughters of God." That's our job. To make sure peace in the church is supreme. Not that there won't be disagreements, there will be. Not that there won't be conflict. People getting angry. People who never get angry don't care. If you care about something, you will get angry. But in the church of the living God, we learn how to deal with conflict and anger and hurt feelings the way Jesus would. Hymn number 382 is a great song of affirmation, of unity, reminding us that in Christ we are to be unified, we are to guard the unity and the peace of our church. Let's stand together, make this our commitment. God, the Father of your people, are seeking to be one. Help us to be one.